the rights to Mr Blobby have been bought and exchanged in the past. And so I wonder whether or not this is also happening. It's a bit like Doctor Who, right? You regenerate in slightly different ways with similar production values.
Welcome to Crashed, where technology crashes into philosophy, politics, ethics, business, and pretty much everything else. Today, that means a lot of crashing into politics. The tech that's messing with elections, the controversial US doctrine Project 2025, and how it could be brought to the UK with a rumoured Project 2029, and how much power the algorithms really still have in politics. I'm Alex Hudson.
And I'm Chris Stoker Walker. Are you going to crash into the end of the week, or have you already crashed before that, Alex?
I have already crashed. I mean, I've been spending so much time trying to understand the framing and narrative shift in domestic contemporary life and how meaningfully the US can be the guide to reframe our narrative. And that is hurting my tiny little brain.
And that is before you get into the fact that British politics is shifting beneath our feet thanks to weird own goals by the Labour government and the Tories in chaos and reform capitalising on all of that as well. So yeah, this is an apposite time when everything is collapsing around us to be talking politics in particular.
You've been having a better time. You've been judging the Freelance Journalism Awards, which feels like a really wholesome pursuit.
Yeah, you know what it is? It has genuinely been really, really interesting, actually. I did once apply for the Freelance Journalism Awards. I was nominated and shortlisted for an award. I'm not in London media circles, so I did not expect to win, but secretly I was hoping that I might, and I did not win. And so I...
Do not blame London. London media metropolitan liberal elite bias is nonsense.
No, to be fair, the person that I lost to is a very, very good journalist, but I was like, I might stand a chance here. But turns out I did not. And so I will just have to live with the sense that I am myself my own biggest hype man. And that is important.
Have the awards been announced yet, or are they still coming up?
No, they have been announced. So they were judged last month. There were some amazing bits of journalism in there. And at a time when, you know, the media industry is struggling, and we can talk about the challenges of staffers disappearing and being replaced by freelancers, I think it does show evidence that actually freelancers can take on that baton and start to actually bring forward good quality journalism, even as they are struggling themselves with some of the realities of just doing this life, which is increasingly difficult.
Who won?
A good question. Why do you ask me this question? Why? I know
judged
who I
the
picked.
thing.
I picked people who didn't necessarily win, but this was, I think, testament to the fact that this competition was so significant. So we had a winner of the best news story was by Hannah Fern, who was a really, really strong, brilliant freelancer. She did a story for The Lead, which was about going inside child prisons and talking about the challenges, including the fact that actually you often could not get out of there during the COVID pandemic. So, you know, one of the things that we talked about, you know, during COVID was often bringing people who were experiencing homelessness in. So we had the Everybody's In campaign, but we didn't think about what happens once you have people already in, for instance, jail systems, prisons or whatever, and how you get them out, at least into the real world and having some semblance of a life outside of that. So it was a really interesting story. I also thought that there was a really, really good one in early career journalism as well, which was about Saudi Arabia's tourism sector. So, yeah, all of those were really, really good. Sorry, I'm in a very weird position. So I've just been on Times Radio. I'm now doing Crashed. And then later today, Alex, I'm going to be on BBC Radio 1. So I'm going to be doing youth programming.
For the average listener of Radio 1, which I think is a 35-year-old man, isn't it? Something like that?
Yeah, well, you would know better than I do. I always find it funny that the BBC's internal terminology for trying to bring in new listeners, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I have friends that work for the Beeb, and so I think I'm pretty correct in saying this, is they call them replenishers. And the reason why they call them replenishers is because effectively they are replenishing the audience that dies.
The replenisher thing is correct, though not necessarily dies, just sometimes grows out of that age group. So replenisher audience for Radio 1 are all the 12, 13-year-olds coming out of Newsround and then moving, and the replenisher audiences for Radio 4 are between 35 and 44-year-old. But your point is? The word replenisher definitely is true.
Okay, I thought it was like some weird tech bro living forever. Give me the blood of young people so that I can continue to remain relevant.
Anyway, our main story. The political populism of Trump's America is likely to come to the UK. And some of its architects may well be involved. It's a political story with deep technological underpinning, so stick with us. It is very politics. But I was having a very off-the-record conversation with a couple of very well-connected people about whether Trump's electoral strategy could be repeated in the UK. The answer was that it is already happening, and some of the exact people involved in Trump's electoral successes are already talking to British politicians and influential names. I then had another conversation to stand it up, and they confirmed something was going on. It all stems from Project 2025, one of the hottest documents in US politics. It's a blueprint produced by the Heritage Foundation titled Mandate for Leadership, the Conservative Promise. It's a 900-page document, so go away and read it if you want. But in the simplest terms, it calls for centralising control under the president, shrinking the administration, dismantling or repurposing government agencies, flattening tax structures, enforcing immigration policies aggressively, and appointing loyal political appointees to key civil service roles. It's a long piece of work, but you get the idea. It centralises control, promotes traditional values at the expense of diversity, equity and inclusion programs, and critics say weakens democratic institutions.
And what's particularly interesting about Project 2025, I suppose, is that Donald Trump spent the entire campaign in 2024 saying this thing did not exist, and now we've kind of gone Scooby-Doo mask off, and actually they're saying it does.
So around half the plan is either completed or in progress, according to the Project 2025 tracker. Around 70% of Trump's cabinet is tied to Project 2025 groups in some way, a DSMOG analysis found, and many of Trump's executive orders mirror, echo, or even repeat part of Project 25's language. So far, so politics, and this is a technology podcast. So the Trump administration has been using the flood the zone tactic. This is a strategy popularized by Steve Bannon, one of the architects of Trump's victory in 2016, and the CEO of his campaign, and now a key figure on the right. It's a tactic to provide information overload, intentionally overwhelm the media and social network with torrents of stories, controversies, and statements, whether they be true, false, exaggerated, or whatever else, so no single one can stick. It means audiences are desensitized, journalists are left scrambling around to react rather than be given time to proactively research, and it means narrative control is maintained. This relies on 24/7 news agendas, shrinking budgets at major corporations, and perhaps most importantly, social media. Just over half of Americans use social media as their primary news source, the most recent Reuters Digital News report found.
I think there's a really interesting adjunct here. So you're explaining that. I'm kind of thinking, well, this ties into what we were talking about just before of the exploitation of the challenges that the media industry is facing. But I was also thinking that actually that flood the zone playbook has two parallels, right? It is Russia under Vladimir Putin in terms of kind of pumping out alternative narratives of what is going on. There's a movie coming out, by the way, about Vladimir Putin, which I heard about just today. Jude Law is playing Vladimir Putin in a movie.
Which I've not heard anything about it.
It sounds absolutely incredible. Probably won't appear in Moscow cinemas, in part because I think it tries to pin, for instance, the 1999 apartment bombings on him and things like that. Ones that have always been a little bit contentious, echoing conspiracy theories. But Putin and others flooded the zone there, as they do in politics. Interesting that Trump is following that sort of same playbook. But it also reminded me that actually when we're talking about flooding the zone, really we're talking about enshittification, right? This is that concept of just what we're seeing in our personal lives with AI slop.
Well, I think that's true because fake news is 70% more likely to be shared than truthful stories and travel across social media 6 times quicker. So that's an MIT study in 2018. And so a lot has changed since then. And so I think the idea of repeating that ad nauseum, which has happened, is no longer directly relevant, but the people using social media as their primary source of news is growing. So here's where the UK come in. So the UK, according to the same Reuters study, it's around 20% of people use social media as their primary source. And the Steve Bannon mentioned earlier is increasingly linked to UK politics, primarily through Farage. So Bannon said Nigel Farage has done so much for British politics in January, and he hosted the Reform Leader on his podcast in July. So in that podcast, he talked about societal collapse. And then Farage said that if you were wearing a watch on the King's Road in London, which is one of the fanciest places in London, you may even be killed because people will want that watch. He also claimed you can shoplift up to £200 of goods in a grocery store and you will not face prosecution. So that statement relies on 2014 shoplifting regulations that were scrapped last year, although even before they were scrapped, it's still allowed for prosecution and potentially a year in prison. So you can see whether flooding the zone is happening. So there's certain similarities between the UK and the US. So Farage has interviewed Kevin D. Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation, who wrote Project 25 Forward on his GB News show, and he spoke at a 2015 Heritage Foundation event. And this is where the whispers come in. That I was having that conversation a couple of weeks ago, and I had it confirmed last week that there is a Project 2029 document being authored. So 2029 is when the next election is expected to be. It has to happen on or before August 2029, and that the right is coalescing around a route to make this doctrine a core part of UK policy. But here's where the playbook goes out the window. It looks increasingly likely that neither Labour leader and Prime Minister Keir Starmer nor the leader of the opposition, Conservative Kemi Badenoch, will lead their respective parties into the next general election. Why that's happening could be a whole podcast by itself. Technology, instant access news, social media, everything plays a big role, but that means that the door is open for British populism flooding the zone. Deepfake chaos, and a few select members of the super wealthy and connected to potentially extend their influence. There are a couple of key names that I keep hearing time and time again: James Orr and Paul Marshall. James Orr is the UK chairman of the Edmund Burke Foundation, which runs NatCon, a right-wing political movement and conference. But perhaps most importantly, he is a good friend of US Vice President JD Vance, and like Vance, has close ties to the billionaire entrepreneur Peter Thiel. Orr is also behind the Centre for a Better Britain, a new think tank that both the Times and the FT have likened to Project 2025 and the Heritage Foundation. We have invited Mr. Orr to speak to us. We have received no comment at this time. The second is Paul Marshall, the owner of GB News, Unheard and now The Spectator. He's an enthusiastic combatant in UK's own version of America's culture wars, according to the FT. And Mr. Marshall is an incredibly difficult person to track down, but we have asked him for comment as best we can. While he doesn't have direct links to Project 2025, he is a director of the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, which is ARC, which creates a similar conference to NatCon, which have both listed Nigel Farage as a speaker.
So I have a question. James or Paul Marshall, you can understand, think about the links to the UK with both of them and why they might want to get across their point of view to a British populace and shape the country in the way that they believe it should be going. What does Steve Bannon get out of this? I don't really understand the Steve Bannon Heritage Foundation stuff. Why are they so keen to export this model?
That is definitely a difficult question, but I think with a lot of the people on the right, it is more Britain going over there, particularly people of the populist right, and trying to understand what Trump did to get them over there. So it's not necessarily that they are hyper interested in bringing their doctrine over to the UK, in as much as sort of our special relationship means that it becomes a sort of a second home for a lot of these people. And a lot of the right of America really has close ties to the UK for business reasons and for political reasons and friendship reasons. But it very much is the British establishment going over there and trying to learn. If you look at the way that Liz Truss has operated over the last couple of years and the way that she has built herself into that movement, you can see the sort of desire there to be accepted by the American right.
Yeah, and I guess there is a symbiotic relationship, right? I mean, when you look at particularly Donald Trump's first term, one of the first people over there in New York to congratulate him at Trump Tower, Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage sees himself as a sort of similar person to Donald Trump, a rebel outside of politics, trying to reshape it from within. I suppose a little bit like a Trojan horse, joining and surprising you, and then taking everything over from the inside.
Well, Steve Bannon referred to Farage as one of Trump's closest friends. I mean, once again, I think Trump has many best friends.
It depends on what day it is, right?
It depends on what day it is. And Bannon is sort of only now fleetingly referenced in the same context as Trump, because it becomes an arm's length relationship since that first election win. But Farage has appeared on stage with Trump. He has appeared on stage at NatCon and our conferences. He is seen as this sort of the British equivalent of Trump, and that is helping his policy. And there are more than a few references to certain things around migration and around the flooding the zone thing that Farage is already using. And I do believe that there are people definitely within the Conservative Party that I've been told, and potentially within the Labour Party, that I am not journalistically going to name because it's not stood up enough to be definitely true, where actually everyone is looking at Trump's playbook because Trump shouldn't have been elected. And it's that success that they're really chasing rather than necessarily the doctrine itself.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you mentioned the idea that there is a belief or an understanding that both Kemi Badenoch and Keir Starmer might not be in their positions by 2029. And so the Labour and Conservatives aren't seen as viable movements for this. I mean, is that Does that matter, do you think, to the people who are kind of the architects of this?
I think for the Conservatives particularly, it depends on what happens after Badenoch. So there are a number of different theories about not if, but when Badenoch will be challenged with leadership.
Yeah.
I think likely that will come at some point towards the end of next year is the best guess from the people I've spoken to. But whomever gets control of the Conservative Party, that will be a key explainer of how much influence Project 2029 and the architects behind that sort of Christian right thinking has on the party and on the UK election, or whether or not Farage will be left alone with that sort of doctrine.
Yeah. So effectively, they're not hugely bothered about who it is. It's just the vessel, right?
I mean, the doctrine be doctrining. I think if the surprising thing when I did have to research this is just how much of that Project 25 policy around migration, around centralizing control, is already being worked on within the first year of Trump. And I think that isn't necessarily possible within the checks and balances of the UK, but it also shouldn't be possible within the US checks and balances. So that's the thing that I think is still, there are many questions to be asked.
So should we be concerned then?
Depends on who you talk to. And it depends on your political views, right? If you think that actually a small state would be good and a closer control on immigration, actually centralizing power away from bureaucracy, then you can see how this doctrine moves things more quickly into the direction you wish it to be. If you want more intersectionality, if you want more diversity and inclusion, if you want a bigger state and if you want more NHS funding, I think this is going to be a concern. And I think the key concern, regardless, is that it risks harming democratic institutions, particularly on the checks and balances within the House of Commons and potentially the House of Lords.
And there's an interesting aspect. As you say, there is a tech angle to this. It is simultaneously taking advantage of the inherent chinks in the armor that we've already got thanks to tech, while also perhaps perpetuating some of those and making them even more significant weaknesses in that kind of democratic aspect.
And in a beautiful segue, that's almost as if that's what we're going to be talking about in a minute. We'll be back in 1 sec. Welcome back. And if the first bit was only just linked to tech, this is actual Where the Technology podcast begins. The fourth industrial revolution is upon us with AI, AR, VR. I can ask an LLM to speculate on ridiculous questions and it will give me thorough answers. And yet every election day, I go to the local school down the road, have my name crossed off in biro, put a few crosses in a few boxes on a bit of paper with a pencil and shove it into the ballot box. High-tech elections we are not. Yet technology is not yet capable of supporting a fully secure internet voting system in the UK, the Institute of Engineering Technology have said, and there is a heightened cybersecurity risk anyway, according to the Parliamentary Office of Science and Technology. And e-voting doesn't really increase the turnout anyway. There are huge trust, security, financial barriers to tech in elections. So, Chris, how can tech actually help with the election process, and what are the risks involved?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, the risks are so enormous, not necessarily because online voting, electronic voting is inherently any more dangerous or prone to manipulation. You mentioned that you use a pencil, for instance. So do I when I go and cast my ballot, but I know an awful lot of people believe that you have to use a pen for whatever reason, because they think that, I don't know, there's someone with a giant rubber that is just there to kind of rub out whatever they have said or whatever they have voted for on their ballot box paper. But there is, I think, a sort of lack of preparation within the UK for a system that would be ready for prime time in a real life election here. And that is in part because we have a slightly shonky system that is already based on a unwritten constitution, and so we're comfortable as a country with that. Of course, when we're talking about the pollution of democratic discourse and the kind of flooding the zone with alternative narratives and the risks that come from that with social media, we may well find that that long-held belief in these sorts of things getting by and working okay, even if there are some kinks in the system, ends up becoming more of an issue. If you find that actually people get uncomfortable going to their local school or their local art gallery and casting their ballot, then if there are enough people with that sort of viewpoint, we might find that we have to move to something different. But the reality is, I think there is just such a distrust of tech that I don't think there is necessarily any better presentation of the truthiness, to use a Stephen Colbert phrase, of online voting versus offline. Like to me, I think if you shifted towards a digital voting system in the UK, at least, beyond the fact that it would just break and fall over probably because that's what digital systems do in the UK often, you would have just such a distrust of it amongst not Luddites, but we are by dint of our nature much more skeptical about whiz-bang stuff. And I think that's because we don't have that, American idealism of, having these big technology companies. We're hampered in some ways by our long history. That means that we don't feel as willing to just chuck that away and reinvent ourselves in a way that, for instance, Estonia would, because obviously they have electronic voting, electronic ID and all that stuff. So I just don't think it would fly for most people. I can't imagine a 65-year-old average person in the UK, who's frankly the people who are going to vote, right, saying, I want to tap my vote on an app. Instead, I think there's something comforting about going to those polling stations.
So the US has different sort of systems for each of the 50 states, has different voting systems and different voting technology. And essentially it becomes that even if you were going to take the laborious task of hacking into the US election, which is still seen as all but impossible, if not impossible, all of the vote rigging allegations that have been found to be false through courts, you would still only manage it in one state. And then you would have to do it another 49 times for it to be able to take over the elections. And so I think if the UK is not big enough, nor is it complicated enough to have, 650 different systems for the 650 different MPs, and so that's where the problem comes. And like you say, I think Britain is still very resistant to change. And there is something beautiful about that bit of paper.
We would also lose the romance of election night and counting, right? Because,
Is that romance?
Yes, I am based in the Northeast, and I wrote a story many moons ago for BuzzFeed News where I went to Sunderland, and the slug on the URL, the little bit after the buzzfeed.com/news, was captioned faster than a speeding ballot. And it was a profile of a guy called Bill Crawford, who is the person who micromanaged at the time Sunderland City Council's attempts to be the first to declare their votes in any general election. And now I think, if you took that away and you just had a sort of tabulated system done electronically, you're right that not only can we not really do that in the UK because we're not a federalised state-based system, we kind of try and have single forms of unity, albeit with some little quirks in terms of they printed their votes on ballots on a different type of paper so that they could rifle through them quicker. That was one of the tips of the trade that Bill Crawford told me about. But I just think that we were too beholden to that system. I also think that people will look at, for instance, the Dominion lawsuit and the allegations that were made against them that were proven to be incorrect and think, well, we don't want to get into that kind of mess here. And there's a big reputational risk behind that, right? I can see us going digital in lots of places. I have now, I think, so many different government-based apps on my phone. I think I have 3 separate ones, which is crazy. But if we look at it, my partner, when she got she got settled status as a EU resident, when she did that in 2019, I think it was, the system did not work on an iPhone. She had to do it on my Android phone in order to actually be able to register here. So our history with this sort of stuff is not very good. So I'm not convinced that's going to work.
Then let's get into the more fun stuff and the more future gazing and the real sort of fine tech of where the 2029 election will be fought. So we think about the Facebook election, the TikTok election, and the so-called, we were going to so-call it the deepfake election last year, which turned out to not be the deepfake election because no one had quite produced deepfakes believable enough. What does 2029 potentially have in store when it comes to tech that will define that election?
I think it's going to be the LLM election. That's not a really bad way of phrasing it. The LLM election. No, LLM action. That's what I want to say. Yeah, I think if you look at the persuasive powers of LLMs and you look at the concerns that we're already seeing around sycophancy, around reinforcing negative behavior, around, frankly, encouraging suicides, as many people in the US are alleging in lawsuits, and as AI companies are starting to recognize and take action to mitigate, there is a real challenge here in terms of, can you persuade, indoctrinate, win the votes of people through LLMs? And to me, I think that's kind of an interesting one. We've kind of had these arguments in the past around the purported biases of social media platforms. The constant cant is that they have a left-wing liberal bias. Any right-winger that you talk to will say that actually, Facebook, Twitter, they're all full of commie lefties that decide that they wanted Joe Biden to win the election and they won't tell you anything because of the woke mind virus or whatever. The reality is that all of the data suggests that actually, because of the Sturm and Drang that the right wing makes about that sort of stuff, there is an implicit, albeit very slight, centre-right bias more generally across social media writ large. If you imagine that being transplanted into an LLM era where actually these tools are designed to be persuasive by design, suddenly I think that becomes even higher stakes. So I would imagine that we're going to see an awful lot of arguments around just what these LLMs are putting out in terms of their viewpoints on particular electoral issues.
Even given their recent sort of push back or pull back a little bit away from healthcare advice or political advice or business advice, they've been very, at least in press releases, been very careful about what they can and can't do now.
They have, but I think that politics is so all-consuming, right? It is the constant drumbeat that plays in the background of everything. We cannot talk about basically any subject without invoking in some way personal politics. And so it becomes incredibly difficult to try and slap guardrails on that. The easy solution that tech companies always go for is, no, you cannot do that. In the early days of DALI, which was Rishi Sunak was prime minister at that point, which gives you an indication of just quite how fast politics moves as well as tech.
So DALI is the image generator that is owned by OpenAI and has since been rolled up into ChatGPT. For those that aren't so in LLM law, that you would know that off the top of your head.
I'm in deep sorry. I remember trying to get, in the run-up to the general election that we had in 2024, DALI to create images of Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer. Now, it wouldn't do so because they had obviously put a thing on there saying, if you mention either of these two names, you are not allowed to do it. We will just stop that model from operating. But you can't really do that if you're saying, well, like, if you're asking an LLM questions about levels of immigration, or any other kind of hot button issue like access to healthcare and how much the small boats crisis amplifies or sort of diminishes the time that you spend waiting on an NHS waiting list, there are implicit comments or ways of presenting that data that could shape an opinion one way or the other that frankly anybody would find quibbles with. And that's one of the challenges, right, of politics, is that you're always going to piss off at least 50% of your electorate. So you're always going to, as a tech company, find someone throwing stones at you saying you're doing something wrong. And I think that is just impossibly difficult to try and resolve, because every AI system is infected with the biases, even if they try and tamp them down, of their creators. We all have these personal foibles, and with the best will in the world, you cannot iron those out. But when they get put onto an LLM, they get amplified, multiplied, and shared across millions of people.
I think 2029, and if this becomes true, there's a sort of punt where I said Nick Clegg would be the new CEO of Twitter. The sort of punt that no one remembers because it obviously wasn't going to be true, but if it does become true, I get cited as being a genius. I think it will be the synthetic influencer election.
Oh.
And what I mean by that is, because I think if you take music industry to be the canary in the coal mine of all things when it comes to marketing, when it comes to experimentation, the number of major releases that have hundreds and hundreds of accounts all set up by record labels or by PR companies that then just supercharge the campaign. They repost and repost and repost the song over and over again, so it feels like it is viral. If someone hears it 5 times, they feel like everyone's listening to it and it feels like a popular thing. And when it comes to a political message, if a person hears a message 5, 10, 15, 20 times, suddenly they think that everyone's talking about it. And just because the political parties, despite it being a very grey area of campaigning law, have set that up themselves, that means that they think that message has become widely shared, even if it's only been done by synthetic influencers.
That would take a lot of change to happen in 4 or 5 years, because we did have an AI influencer running for election in 2024, right? We had a guy called AI Steve, which was the AI representation of Steve Endicott, who was, I think, a Sussex businessman who was running for Brighton Pavilion.
It's different. I think it's not necessarily that they're going to run for candidacy. It's more that if you have insert new MP name here, because I don't want to get into all manner of libel problems about naming a particular MP, because there's no reason why we would think any one MP would do it. An MP would hire a PR company, and maybe with them knowing, maybe without them knowing, there are 1,000 different bot accounts all pushing the same message, and it looks like a real person, and it sounds like a real person, and it feels like cohort analysis voter that you're really trying to target. They just don't happen to be real. And that could either be done with synthetic influencers, or if you want to spend a load of money, with actual influencers, with real life influencers. But given that now some of the big FTSE companies are spending 50% of their marketing spend with the influencers, that's already bleeding over into Westminster, and the smarter ones, particularly if there's new leaders in play, will try and leverage that. And it's a real grey area of what is and what isn't allowed, but there are no clear rules on what is and what isn't.
Yeah, technology moves incredibly quickly, so I can envisage that might be a real risk back then. Should we do a little quiz for you? Brighton Pavilion, 75,000 or so voters eligible to vote in the election. 70% of them did. It's not a big spoiler to say that Sean Berry of the Green Party won that seat. I think many people might recognise Sean Berry's name. How many votes do you think Steve AI got?
2,000.
The 2029 projection, I think. He got a staggering, thwonking 179.
22.
I'm as guilty of this as anybody else, is that we tend to ascribe technology a greater role in an election cycle than it actually has. And generally what happens is we tend to label it one cycle ahead of when it actually happens. So I remember the last but one election was seen as kind of like, well, actually the last but 2 elections almost were seen as the TikTok election. Gosh, I've lost track. That would be Theresa May, maybe. That was seen as a kind of social media election. Turned out that it was really the next one. That was the true TikTok one. I think what we might see here is Steve AI being the vanguard of this revolution. So we mock him now.
No, he won't. But the AI guy will not be the... However, like Count Binface, on the other hand...
He did well. He did. Yeah, everybody knows Count Binface. Who doesn't know Count Binface?
While you've been speaking, of course, I've been listening to intently, but I've also been searching Count Binface's electoral history. Pop quiz to you. In the 2024 election, where he faced in the Richmond and Northallerton constituency, the one where Rishi Sunak, once again, no spoilers, was retained as Conservative MP for that era, with a voting share of 47.5%. How many votes do you believe that Count Binface received?
Well, you've not given me a very important data point there, Alex, which is I gave you both the turnout and also I gave you the number of eligible electors.
There are around 47,000 votes, but I am on the official UK Parliament. Hold on. Electorate of 73,886.
Okay, but 47% of them voted. So
a voting count of 48,526.
I'm going to say that Count Binface got 8,000 votes.
Once again, wildly optimistic. Maybe it's 2029. He had 308 votes. A terrible performance.
You know what? He had 3,000 votes in my heart.
I think that might be the London Mayor thing, or when he faced off against Boris. He gets around. He's
a bit like Mr Blobby, where I think that actually there have been multiple Count Binfaces and they've kind of passed from one to another. I do sometimes wonder, because Mr Blobby the rights to Mr Blobby have been bought and exchanged in the past. And so I kind of wonder whether or not this is also happening here, whether or not there are multiple count bin faces appearing in multiple ways, and you kind of earn the rights to it and trade it on. It's a bit like Doctor Who, right? You regenerate in slightly different ways with similar production values if you are a fan of the early series.
Well, Blobby, we're now way off topic. This has nothing to do with technology, but Blobby is currently in the news for being the subject of a trademark row. But also, I'm not sure if you've seen that viral clip of him turning up to a birthday party, and it's one of the funniest things. It's just beautifully wholesome. The person's partner said they really wanted Mr Blobby to come to their party, and no one knows how much is real and how much is just for social, but he sort of just plays the Blobby theme tune, and you just see Blobby come through the door and just mess up everything. And it is both terrifying, because Mr Blobby is terrifying, and beautifully heartwarming, aggressively lovely. Right, after that insightful technology conversation, somehow leaving us on Mr Blobby, we'll be back to talk about EU AI regulation, actual technology, in a moment. Welcome back, and this time we're going to try and actually stay on technology. Chris, you ready? We're going to try. It might work, it might not. As we talked about last episode, the European Union is trying to get ahead in the AI race. The European Commission is proposing to pause some of its AI laws because, the Financial Times reports, there has been intense pressure from the US government and big tech. There'll be a big decision on its so-called simplification package on November the 19th. Chris, what is this simplification?
It is an attempt to try and make things simpler because there is a belief that European regulation is too difficult, but that's at least what the European Commission says. If you look at the actual draft text of what is happening, because European legislators are incredibly handy when it comes to handing things to journalists, so we already basically know what this simplification is going to look like. Then they are effectively running a coach and horses through the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, the landmark bit of data protection regulation that frankly is the envy of the world in many ways, because actually it has had this outsized impact beyond the 450 million people in the EU and has an impact on how data is protected for users worldwide, billions of them. They're going to effectively weaken that. They're saying that we need to make compromises on this, including having the opportunity for AI companies to come in, use your personal data to try and train their models, because we don't want to be seen as sticks in the mud. So this is an attempt by the EU, by the European Commission, to try and salvage the hugely unpopular AI Act that they have put into force that is seen as tamping down too much stuff. And to try and solve that problem, they've decided that they are willing to sacrifice seemingly key tenets of the GDPR. That has got people furious.
So the Centre for AI and Digital Policy President, Merv Hickok, have never heard that name out loud, so apologies if I've got it wrong, said the Commission's so-called simplification will let loose unsafe AI systems in the EU that will threaten public safety and fundamental rights. The current reporting requirements are the bare minimum for AI accountability and transparency. So he's kind of echoing what you're saying. And actually, if GDPR was a good thing, and this undermines it, does that mean that the EU, to compete in the capitalist AI race to the fourth industrial revolution, the compromises have to be found, and this is their compromise?
Yeah, I think so. And you've mentioned one person there. There is another guy that I trust an awful lot, Johnny Ryan, who is from the Irish Council for Civil Liberties. I speak to him an awful lot. He has poured through the purported changes that are going to be made here, and he basically says that if these changes are implemented, then Mario Draghi, who is overseeing this, will have handed giant US and Chinese firms a great gift and done Europe a great disservice.
If this regulation gets simplified, using their words, does that mean that we are then on an even keel with the US, or does that mean that we are behind where the US's rights are on digital privacy and rights to rights to that data.
No, I mean, there is still a massive gulf. To use a really crude analogy, think about the comparison between food safety laws in the US. Like, they have all sorts of crazy stuff that goes into their ready meals and their fast food that we just do not allow in the UK or in the EU. So while we're taking a step back, we are still way ahead of the US, at least large parts of the US. The California Consumer Protection Act, the CCPA, we were talking about federalism and the way in which states can often go their own way in terms of elections earlier. Ditto when it comes to data protection regulation. The CCPA is almost a carbon copy of the GDPR. Basically, Californian legislators said, hey, we like the look of this GDPR that you've got in the EU. Let's transplant that over into our state in order to protect our people. But for the vast majority of Americans, at least, Europeans will still have a much stronger, much more resilient data protection system than the US does. It's just that it will still be significantly weaker than what we have at the minute. And for all that people grouse about cookie banners and things like that, I would still much rather be in a system where I have to occasionally click allow all cookies or whatever, where my data is relatively well protected, than a one in which I don't and my data is not.
I assumed that California's regulation introduction was going to be the first part of the US looking towards GDPR for that sanctity of data and safety of data, and yet this appears to be going back. And then what happens in 3 years with or without Trump? It's how long this policy takes to move in an already slow-moving multi-country bloc compared to the US is a lot quicker moving and a lot more blunt with its demands. And so I think that's where the confusion comes. The US can make demands more quickly than the EU can react to it. And so that's going to be the big battle that comes on in weeks, months, years to come.
Yeah, and you've got to remember Donald Trump is, a negotiator who is willing to be a brinksman. And I think that is one of the big concerns here. Is it looks like that strategy has worked for Trump. I didn't imagine that we would see this watering down of data protection regulation in order to try and appease some of those queries. The other thing that we have to consider is that there is a huge lobbying effort going on. I mean, there was recent data about the scale of European tech lobbying, or rather tech lobbying within Europe, reached record levels last year. I think that it is among the top 3 sectors that spend the most on lobbying in Europe. So there is an awful lot of pressure going on here. I spoke to Kim van Sparentak, a European MEP, several years ago, about just the volume of correspondence that she gets from lobbyists for tech companies. This was several years ago now. This has scaled up enormously. And she said that they're almost swimming in it.
We're meant to be more optimistic on this. We've gone through like the death of democracy, the end of GDPR and the rights to your own digital data, and the end to fair elections. So,
well, I have a funny video to ask you about and the questions for which there are no answers. So light is on the horizon.
My question, there is no answer to, is really deep and serious. So you line it up.
Okay. So, questions to which there is no answer. My question to you, Alex, is how difficult is it to make a humanoid robot walk?
Oh, mate, you've done like a "Have I Got News for You" version of that question. That's like, oh, everyone knows what this is about. It's about the Russian robot that tried to walk along and then it fell over and then it smashed into bits and then they pulled up a really terribly constructed black curtain before they were picking pieces up off the floor. I think it is the anthropomorphization of robots is stupid. It is that I think we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. It is inefficient for most jobs. Whether it be closing a dishwasher or walking along, we have wheels, we have tracks. There is no reason to have legs. It's stupid. It goes slower. It's less efficient. It's more complicated. And unsurprisingly, as this video, if you haven't seen it, go watch it. If you search for Russian AI robot walking, it's very, very funny. Never looked like it was going to stay up for long, but that demo has been replicated a few times. Like every time Musk tries something like that, I think was it the last Musk one, or the one that must be before, where it had a bit of a stumble with one of Musk's robots. It is very difficult because we're trying to solve a problem that doesn't exist.
Yeah,
that problem isn't. What did you think?
Well, I thought it was fantastic. I also, it made me laugh so much, and it's brilliant. I mean, good on the Russian company involved trying to do this, it highlights the importance of global trade and what happens if you invade a country and you end up being unable to actually engage in that global trade. Because what happened here is effectively this company, which is Russian made, were trying to develop a humanoid robot that basically only has Russian made components. Now, they're not quite at that stage yet. They admitted that it was about 77% Russian made components, but it turns out that it's really difficult to make robots that work. So there was a brilliant quote from the CEO of the company that was behind this called Idle. So his name is Vladimir Vitukin. He put a very sort of positive spin on this. He said, you know what, this is real-time learning, when a good mistake turns into knowledge and a bad mistake turns into experience. So I think we can take from that a little motto on which to live our lives.
So deep. My one is much simpler. How long will Keir Starmer last?
It depends. Are you Wes Streeting or one of his allies? Look, so it seems like he's going to last the rest of the week. It seems like he's going to last until the budget. I mean, look, the UK would be crackers if they chose to try and get rid of him before the budget. The Labour Party would be bonkers, truthfully. So I think that what we will see is he's not going to be leading us into 2029, right? I mean, this is just impossible to conceive of. The Project 2029 prediction that Labour and the Conservatives will have different leaders, absolutely true, I think. But I guess the question is who replaces him, because Wes Streeting seems like the favourite, but has kind of had to rule himself out, at least temporarily now. Don't know who else you would have around the corner. Probably not Peter Kyle, the ex-Tech Secretary, because I think that he would perhaps struggle somewhat with the seriousness of the brief. How long do you think he's going to last?
So briefly, I think Wes Streeting is the overwhelming favourite, and there are a few things I will talk to you about the second we finish recording this as to why that is still very likely, but I'm not talking about it in a place where the public can listen to it. Sorry. And I think my best guess, it all hinges on the local elections next May, and whatever happens in that if that goes however it plays, whether it plays disastrously, that means that Starmer will likely have a leadership challenge then. He could still win it, but we that depends. I think it would be unlikely for anything to happen before that point, because there is no sort of voting evidence around Starmer's performance or lack thereof. What would have
to happen in the local elections in order for people not to move against Starmer? Because, like, if you look at the polling, if you look at the general direction of travel, Reform is going to sweep that, right? Like, that's a foregone conclusion. So I guess my question is, how badly do you think, as someone who wears a political hat and a tech hat, how badly do you think Keir Starmer would have to lose by in order to not be turfed out?
Anything that is better than expected, he stays. And I also think the Conservatives and the right are traditionally really good at getting rid of their leader. If you look at Thatcher, if you look at Boris, if you even look at Sunak, all of it's incredibly efficient. It's brutal, but it's efficient. The left is historically very bad at getting rid of their leader. Look at how long Blair stayed beyond what was reasonable. If you look at Corbyn and where the Popular Party was and where he was, and yet he maintained until an election. I still think there is a perfectly reasonable expectation that Starmer could lead. Until maybe a couple of weeks ago, I thought Starmer was a dead cert to lead Labour into the 2029 election. And I also think it depends on how far tech progresses into the sort of Web3 hyper fragmentation, because if all of the chattering classes are in the same Discord group and they're all in the same WhatsApp group and they all choose for him to go, that's where tech plays its role. Whereas before you could see the wind of change coming a mile off from the more public social media that was the case up until the last couple of years.
Yeah, my favourite thing is you just mentioned Discord there. I love HM Treasury's Discord chat. It's just so rubbish, and I don't really understand why it exists.
Next question is why you're on the Treasury's Discord.
Well, because it's my job, right? I'm a tech journalist, so they basically post videos. So the last one that they posted was 2 days ago from Rachel Reeves. It's a YouTube short, and it says, you want your money to go to public services, we get that. And it's basically a clip of Rachel Reeves talking, and the responses are 4 people have responded with a pregnant emoji, 46 people have responded with a trans rights emoji, 5 people have responded with a Russian emoji, and then there are a collection of just various letters which have been very intelligently spelled out by the people who are running the Discord to spell CUNTS in terms of the emoji.
Forgive me for not being as online as perhaps the Discord is. What does the pregnant emoji mean?
I don't know. I mean, it's Discord. It could be literally anything.
If you know, get in touch. I feel like we've just outed ourselves as not being online enough. Hold on.
It's the second most embarrassing search that you could do beyond what does 6-7 mean.
It's usually described as somebody hot.
There you go then. It describes somebody hot.
Or pregnancy, or feeling full after eating too much.
With that insightful...
And that is more than enough from Mr Blobby to pregnant emojis to the downfall of Western democracy. We will... That is more than enough for today. So Crash Just and Everything Popular is Wrong production. The title music is from Nuffer. Check them out if you haven't already. And we will see you next week.